talks about youth accountability, particularly now in Africa, it must be seen in the context of a number of issues. Number one, that Africa is the youngest continent on earth now. The average age, I think, is just 20. And in countries like Uganda, the average age is 16. And these young men and women are young men and women who have the capacity to serve the continent. And the question that is now being asked, particularly in this era of COVID, is whether young men and women will have opportunities for employment. But I think that going forward, employment must not be the focus of our young men and women. What our focus should be is innovation and invention, and taking into account the dividends that we can derive from the fourth industrial revolution. And in saying this, I'm not naive, because I know when we talk about young Africans, we've got to ask ourselves that where are these young Africans? There are those young Africans who are in fisher communities in places such as Lake Victoria, Lake Turkana, Lake Choga, and Lake Nyasa, Lake Malawi. How do we take care of them? And when we talk about, we also are aware of those who are in the livestock communities in places like Turkana, in Kenya, in Namibia, in Botswana. So there are different target groups when we talk about young people. The other thing that we must be alive to is the reality that we have 17 sustainable development goals. And goal number 1 is reduction of poverty. Goal number 2 is dealing with hunger. Then we talk about education. We talk about the education not only of the girl child, but also of the boy child, and how we are going to ensure that young people are immunized from the problems that will afflict them if they don't participate in the economies. We also are aware that we are talking about the pillars of development under Africa Agenda 2063. So there are many issues, and I'm aware that you want me to talk about accountability. In my understanding, when we talk about accountability, we must now be talking about what is called co-generational leadership, so that young men and young women work together with people who are older. And just as the African saying goes, when mother cow is chewing cud, baby cow is watching and watching keenly so that they learn the positive things and also they unlearn the negative things. So critically, I am saying that there is need to create a new young African, a young African who is disciplined, a young African who has written, a young African who has vision, a young African who has passion, a young African who is sympathetic and compassionate, a young African whose life is planned, a young African who has interest in ensuring that his or her community is developed, a young African who is exposed, a young African who has regard for his or her culture, but realizing that culture is not static, culture is dynamic. A young African who asks, in the famous words of the American president, not what his country can do for him or her, or what his community can do for him or her, but what he or she can do for his country and his community, and by extension, his or her continent. That is the young African whom we must grow, and that young African will ultimately be accountable not only to himself or herself, but to the community and to the world.